Well, okay, everybody. We will go ahead and get started. We have Joe Lansdale here. We have our moderator, Kathleen Kent. And I don't know if I'm frozen or not, but I guess I'm not. Well, I'll restart. I'm Blake Kimsey. I'm the Executive Director of Writing Workshops Dallas. And together with Gemini Inc. and David Samuel Levinson, we've created the Big Texas Read, and it has been so much fun to have this to look forward to during the pandemic. I'm going to hand it over to Alexandra Vandekamp here in just a second, Executive Director of Gemini Inc. And but I just want to thank at the top our bookstores, our independent bookstores, Interrobang Books here in Dallas, the Twig Bookshop in San Antonio, who have been very supportive of helping us spread the word, get books out to readers. And I also want to thank the University of Texas San Antonio Library System, as well as Lone Star Literary. Lone Star Literary has a lot of great events going around. They list all the events that are going on in Texas literary-wise. So check them out at Lone Star Literary if you haven't. We are so happy that you're here tonight for this great conversation between Joe Lansdale and Kathleen Kent. And I'm going to hand it over now to Alexandra Vandekamp. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks for coming, everyone. My job is pretty simple tonight. I'm ED of Gemini Inc. We're a writing art center in San Antonio. Believe it or not, we've been a writing art center for 27 years. We have workshops that teach the craft of writing. We try to help people bring their stories to life. And then we want to have people meet and encounter great story makers. So when Blake approached me about this idea of the Big Texas Read, I just really loved it. And can I just say, no matter what kind of day I've had, I always am energized after these conversations. You know what I mean? They just feed me. So I have the wonderful job of introducing our moderator tonight, Kathleen Kent, who we were so lucky to feature in June and July. And she's wearing a different hat tonight as moderator. So we're very much looking forward to the conversation. You can put some questions in chat if you're inspired while listening, and we'll pluck and pick from them later on. And let me just introduce Kathleen, and then she's going to just take it over from there. So Kathleen is a New York Times bestselling author. Her fourth book is titled The Dime. It's a contemporary crime novel set in Dallas, and it's been nominated by both the Edgar Awards and the Nair Awards for Best Novel. The sequel to The Dime, titled The Burn, she's got great titles, was published in February. She's also the author of 3 best-selling and award-winning historical novels, The Heretic's Daughter, The Traitor's Wife, and The Outcasts. She's a wonderful writer, a wonderful speaker on the writing process, and we're just thrilled to have her moderating tonight. So Kathleen, I'll let you take it from here.
Great. Thank you so much. I want to welcome everybody tonight. It looks like we've got a great virtual crowd from all over Texas and as far away as California. I do want to thank Alexandra and Blake and David for doing the work to put this together. This fantastic program has been so much fun and just so illuminating and uplifting to hear these wonderful authors talk about their work. And I'm going to be talking with the wonderful and hardworking Joe Lansdale. And Joe, you and I met. I had read your work and I'd been a big fan of yours, but I'd never met you until, I guess it was about 7 years ago. We were on tour together. I think you were promoting Rusty Puppy, which was the number 12 in the Hap and Leonard series, and I think I was doing The Outcast. But we got to talking, and I felt like you were a brother from another mother. We both grew up in East Texas, you in Gladewater, me in Kilgore, and we both had challenging childhoods growing up, and I loved what you said, that you weren't poor, you didn't grow up poor, just broke. And I thought that was so poignant that you made that distinction. So I want to, I'm going to give a brief introduction. I'm sure many people here know of your accomplishments, but I'm going to summarize some of your many accomplishments. And then if you will read a short passage from The Edge of Dark Water, our book club choice, and then you and I can have a conversation, and I'm so eager to talk to you about your process and the inspirations behind this book. Joe Lansdale, as of well, I don't know, a month or two ago. This could all change because Joe is one of the most prolific and innovative writer I've ever met. But as of a few months ago, he'd written 45 novels, 30 short story collections, chapbooks, graphic novel adaptations. A few of his many awards include 10 Bram Stoker Awards, a British Fantasy Award, an Edgar Award for The Bottoms, one of my all-time favorites, and the World Horror Convention Grandmaster Award. He was inducted into the Texas Literary Hall of Fame, and several of his novels and short stories have been adapted to film, which we'll talk a little bit later on. But to say that Joe writes historical fiction and crime and science fiction and graphic novels is to really do him a disservice, because Joe's crossed and intermingled and cross-pollinated all of these genres into his fictional works, and so he's kind of bent the barriers, broken through the barriers of classifying a writer into a particular genre. And that's part of the delight of reading his work, is because there is this cross-pollination. So Joe, with that, would you read a short passage from the book before we get started?
I will. And first of all, before I start reading, can everyone hear me correctly? Am I not cutting out? Am I okay?
You sound good.
Sound good.
All right. We'll take your word for it. All right. This is From the Edge of Dark Water, and this is chapter 1. I'm not going to read the entire chapter, but I'm going to read a portion of it. That summer, Daddy went from telephoning and dynamiting fish to poisoning them with green walnuts. The dynamite was messy, and a couple of years before, he'd somehow got 2 fingers blown off, and the side of his face had a burn spot that at first glance looked like a lipstick kiss, and at second glance looked like some kind of rash. Telephoning for fish worked all right, though not as good as dynamite, but Daddy didn't like cranking that telephone to hot up the wire that went into the water to electrocute the fish. He said he was always afraid one of them little colored boys that lived up from us might be out there swimming and get a dose of electricity that would kill him deader than a cypress stump, or best do something to his brain and make him retarded as his cousin Ronnie, who didn't have enough sense to get in out of the rain and might hesitate in a hailstorm. My grandma, the nasty old bag, who fortunately is dead now, claimed Daddy has what she called the sight. She said he was gifted and could see the future some. I reckon if that was so, he'd have thought ahead enough not to get drunk when he was handling explosives and got his fingers blown off. And I hadn't ever seen that much sympathy from him concerning colored folks, so I didn't buy his excuse for not cranking the phone. He didn't like my friend Jinx Smith, who was colored, and he tried to make out we was better than her and her family, even though they had a small but clean house, and we had a large dirty house with a sagging porch and the chimney propped up on one side with a 2x4, and there were a couple of hogs walling out holes in the yard. As for his cousin Ronnie, I don't think Daddy cared for him one way or the other, and he often made fun of him and imitated him by pretending to bang into walls and slobbered about. Of course, when he was good and drunk, this wasn't an imitation, just a similarity. Then again, maybe Daddy could see the future, but was just too stupid to do anything about it. Anyway, Daddy had these tow sacks, about 10 of them, and he and Uncle Gene had them full of green walnuts and some rocks to heavy them up, and they had them fastened on ropes and thrown out in the water, the ropes tied off to roots and trees on the shore. Me and my friend Terry Thomas had gone down there to watch and help because we didn't have nothing else we wanted to do. Terry didn't want to go when I told him what I wanted to do and where we were going and that I wanted him there with me. But he broke down finally and went and helped me toss bags and pull up fish. He was real nervous about the whole thing because he didn't like either my daddy or my uncle. I didn't like them either, but I like being outside and doing things that men do, though I think I would have been more happy with a line and a hook than bags of walnut poison. Still, I like the river and the outdoors better than I like being at the house with a mop in my hand. My grandma, on Daddy's side, always said I didn't act like a girl at all and I ought to stay home learning how to keep a garden and shell peas and do women's work. Grandma would lean forward in a rocker, look at me with no love in her gooey eyes and say, "So, Ellen, how you gonna get a husband you can't cook or clean worth a flip and don't never do your hair up?" Of course, she wasn't being fair. I'd already been doing women's work for as long as I could remember. I just wasn't no good at it. And if you've ever done any of it, you know it ain't any fun at all. I like doing what the boys and men did, what my daddy did, which, when you got right down to it, didn't seem like all that much, just fishing and trapping for skins to sell, shooting squirrels out of trees and bragging about it like they'd done killed tigers. Most of that bragging took place after he got liquored up good. I'd had me a taste of liquor once, and I didn't like it. I can say the same for chewing tobacco and cigarettes and anything that's got lettuce in it. As for putting my hair up, she was really talking about certain religious ways, and I couldn't figure that God, with all he had to worry about, would be all that concerned with hairdos. This day I'm telling you about, Daddy and Uncle Gene was drinking a little and tossing those sacks, and the water was turning dark brown where the walnuts went in. After a while, sure enough, a bunch of brim and sun perch come a-floating belly up. Me and Terry stood on the shore and watched while Daddy and Uncle Gene got in the rowboat and pushed off and went out there with nets and gathered them fish like pecans that had fell on the ground. There were so many I knew we'd be eating fried fish not only tonight, but tomorrow night, and after that we'd be eating dried fish, which is another thing I forgot to put on my list of stuff I don't like. Gene says dried fish taste like stained short smell, and she won't get an argument from me. If they weren't smoked proper, they was all right. If they were smoked proper, they was all right. But dried fish are a lot like trying to chew on a dead dog's tit. Walnuts didn't really poison the fish to death, but it stunned them up a mite and made them float to the surface, white bellies showing, working their gills. Daddy and Gene gathered them up with nets on a stick and put them in wet tow sacks for gutting and cleaning. The sacks was tied to the shore with ropes, and me and Terry went down there to start pulling them in. The walnuts still had enough green in them they could be used down river to stun more fish, so we was supposed to save them. We got hold of a rope and started pulling, but it was real heavy and we couldn't do it. Well, be there directly to help you, Daddy called from the boat. I think we should cut this one loose, Terry said to me. No use straining our guts out. I don't quit that easy, I said, and looked up to see what was going on with the boat. It had a hole in the bottom, so Daddy and Uncle Gene couldn't stay out long. Uncle Gene had to bail it out with a coffee can while Daddy paddled the boat back to the bank. When they had it pulled out of the water, they came over to help us. Damn, Daddy said, either them walnuts has got heavy as a Ford or I gotten weak. You've gotten weak, Uncle Gene said. You ain't the man you once was. You ain't the strapping example of prime manhood. I am. Daddy grinned at him. Hell, you're older than me. Yeah, said Uncle Gene, but I took care of myself. Daddy let out with a hooting sound, said, ha! Uncle Gene was fat as a hog, but without the personality. Still, he was a big man in height and had broad shoulders and arms about the size of a horse's neck. Daddy didn't even look kin to him. He was a skinny peckerwood with a pot belly, and if you ever saw him without a cap, it was because it had rotted off his head. He and Uncle Gene had about 18 teeth between them, and Daddy had most of them. Mama said it was because they didn't brush their teeth enough and they chewed tobacco. There were times when I looked at their sunken faces and was reminded of an old pumpkin rotting in the field. I know it's a sad thing to be so repulsed by your own kin, but there you have it, straight out and in the open. We all pulled on the rope, and finally, just about the time I thought I was going to strain my guts out, up come that bag, only it wasn't just the bag. There was something caught up in it, all swole up and white and dangling long strands of wet grass. Now, wait a minute here, Daddy said, and kept pulling. And I seen it wasn't grass at all. It was hair. And under that hair was a face, big, round as a moon, and white as a sheet, and puffy looking as a feathered pillow. I didn't know who it was right off till I seen the dress. It was the only dress I'd ever seen Maylin Baxter wear. A dress spotted with blue flowers and so faded you could barely tell what color the flowers had been in the first place. And it had gone a mite short on her as she had grown tall. Only time I'd seen her not wearing it that I could remember was when me and her and Terry and Jinx slipped out one night, went to the swimming hole for a dip. I had thought she was so pretty there in the moonlight, not a stitch on, well formed, with moon blonde hair to her waist and that dress hanging on a limb next to the river. She moved like she was hearing music we couldn't. I knew then she was going to be the kind of girl that made single men turn their heads and take a deep breath, and married men wish their wives would catch on fire. Fact was, she was already that kind of girl. Terry didn't pay her no mind, and I think it's because he might be a sissy. There's rumor he is, and part of the rumor has to do with a boy from the far end of the river that come up one summer to visit relatives. I don't know if it's true, but I don't care one way or other. I've known Terry since we was babies, and what I've seen of man and woman love, it mostly has to do with Daddy lying around and not doing much, getting drunk, and hitting Mama and I. One time after he beat her up pretty good and went out fishing, a rainstorm come up, and I lay on my bed hoping a bolt of lightning would shoot out of the sky and hit him on top of the head and knock them few teeth out of his skull and kill him, leaving nothing behind but his cat. I know that's mean, but that's how I was thinking. I didn't like that Mama thought she deserved that ass whipping. She thought a man was the one ran things and had to say. She said it was in the Bible. That put me off reading it right away. I'm going to stop there.
Great. That's so great. Thank you, Joe. I apologize. I've got some lagging going on, so let me know if you need me to repeat a question for you. The book is set during the Depression, and I know that your parents, your mother and father, both worked very hard to survive the Great Depression, and I know that your dad, especially, was a great storyteller. Were there experiences, their difficulties going through the Depression? Did that inspire a part of this book, or did that inform some of the situations?
Absolutely. My father was 42 when I was born, and my mother was 38, and that my dad was born in 1909. I believe my mother was 1914, and so they were older parents, and in some way like grandparents. But my grandmother, my only surviving grandparent, lived to be nearly 100, and she had seen Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, and she had been through a lot of hard times. She had not only seen Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, she had seen men go to the moon, and so she had this long arc of changes in time. And then my parents had this experience of growing up. My father rode horses and things like that during his childhood, and then they both lived through the Great Depression. And my father even, he worked all kinds of jobs. He even spent a little time catching the train and going from fair to fair and boxing and wrestling in fairs to make a little money. He worked in, a canning company in Lansdale, and he eventually, my mother got him an old Model T car and said, take that thing apart, or maybe it's a Model A, I get those mixed up, said, take that thing apart so you can do it blindfold, put it back together blindfold. And he did. And eventually he became a mechanic, which he was most of the time in my memory. I remember us traveling when I was a kid from East Texas out to Arizona, and them doing field work along the way, picking cotton and whatever it was, or orchard. I don't remember all. I remember some things with trees, and I remember the cotton. I remember I tried to pick it and got a sunstroke. And but I grew up with them, and they shot squirrels along the way and went hunting. That's how we ate. And so I grew up poor, but I grew up well loved and well cared for. And my parents installed a lot of confidence in me. And as you said earlier, we didn't think of ourselves as poor. We thought of ourselves as broke. So it was a different viewpoint, but they were from the Great Depression. So they were very, very careful about saving everything, which I still do. I just sort of tried to get out of that, because I'll think, do I really need all these rubber bands and string and paper clips? And no, I don't, but it always hurts me to throw anything away that's usable. And they were that thing, clean your plate, because back when they were kids, they may not have much to eat. I remember my mother saying at one time their entire family had nothing but several pounds of onions to eat over a long period of time. I mean, they fried them, they boiled, whatever, but an onion is an onion, even if you like an onion. And after a while, they were pretty well burned out on onions. But, I grew up in that sort of atmosphere that this was, once upon a time, it was damn hard out there. And even in the 50s, though, I think that was probably the best period for my parents, we were still poor, and I never thought of myself that way because so many people around us were pretty much in the same condition. And so I grew up with that, but I also grew up in a very racist society. I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and if you think it's racist now, if you were to go back then, it would be like an absolute culture shock. It would just blow the top of your head off. And so all of those things, the racism of the time, the stories from the 30s, and actually and even going back to my grandmother and my other grandparents who I heard stories about, although they were all dead when I was born except for her, contributed to the way I write novels. And you know, sometimes I get well outside of that, but in general, those echoes reverberate through everything I do.
Right, and you know, there are consistent themes through almost all of your books. A lot of it has to do with racial injustice, misogyny, domestic violence, and there's kind of this recognition of that there must be something better. And I'm wondering, you know, a lot of times for people who grow up in small communities, impoverished, it's very difficult for them to break out of those patterns. Do you think that initially reading helped you to break out of those claustrophobic ideas about race and gender?
That's a good question. I'm glad you asked that. You know, the short answer is yes, but the long answer is there were a lot of factors. And you know, when you grow up with racism and you hear people calling people certain names or treating them a certain way, it seems like that's the way it's supposed to be because that's what you've seen from your childhood. And my father was very much a verbal racist, but he did treat people fairly. My mother, on the other hand, would always tell me, you know, I remember one time we went to a theater in Gladewater, Texas, the Cozy Theater, and there was a separate entrance for the black customers. And they would have to wait till the white customers all got their tickets before they could even get a ticket. It wasn't done back and forth, you know. And I remember seeing all the black people going up this in the stairwell into the theater. And I asked my mom, I said, why are those people going up the stairs? And she said, I can't explain it to you, but it's not right. And it won't always be that way. Well, you know, I didn't at that age have an incredible epiphany right then, but it was a beginning of, you know, there's something different here. And then I read Huckleberry Finn and I understood something different then because, you know, Huckleberry Finn goes through these things where it's the best novel in the world and it's the worst. It's anti-racist, and it's anti-racist. And it's easy to see that if you don't just say, I look at this word and I'm offended. When you look at its message and you look at the context, then you realize, and it moved me. It one of the things that changed the way I saw race. And then I read To Kill a Mockingbird later, and that contributed to it too, because, you know, white people have to have an entranceway into understanding that racism exists. And those are books that did that for me. Because when I read Huckleberry Finn, that wasn't as far removed from my people and my experience as it might be for people now, you know, and I understood what was going on there because, you know, my father grew up telling me stories about Billy the Kid and, you know, and he knew Bonnie and Clyde and actually knew them, you know, but he had all these legends and he had all these true stories and he had all these things. And when you see, you know, black people had no opportunities. I was poor, and I'm not trying to say I had tremendous opportunities, but whatever opportunities I didn't have, they had less. So I was able, through reading and through the will of my parents to give me confidence, which they did, to rise above that and to think better about things and begin to understand that what black people were going through, you know, and this wasn't just a thing, well, they're not working hard enough. You know, there were no jobs for them. There were no opportunities for them. And integration was the beginning of the change in education when I was a kid, but, you know, it was segregated when I was very young. And even then there wasn't true integration, maybe the school, but when they would go to a restaurant, it was still just like it had always been. You know, you didn't come in the restaurant. And I hear young people say, oh, I would, but no, they didn't. The black people that were working in that time and dealing with those things in time were, like any working people, they were heroes of mine because they knew what they had to do to take care of their family. They were under incredible pressure and under restrictions that the rest of us don't have. You know, and I've never felt white guilt. I don't feel white guilt at all. I feel humanity guilt. As a human being, for people in general, it's important for us to understand that, you know, we don't need to choose up sides. I'm not for any kind of segregating ideas or books or anything like that. I think we have to start saying what we were learning then and what we seem to have not continued on the path to do, and that's to give people real opportunity. And so I think that I really did have opportunities that a lot of Black people I knew growing up, and sometimes I knew them peripherally, sometimes I knew them more directly, never had, and we're not going to have for a generation or more. And I remember too that getting a lot of my storytelling from a lot of the Black farmers. When I was born in Gladewater, but I lived in Mount Enterprise for a few years before I moved back to Gladewater. And in Mount Enterprise, I used to go up to buy comic books at Pete and May Green's store. And right next to that, or near it, there was a feed store. And this is where, and feed and seed. And this was where a lot of farmers came. Well, there were still people having wagons and mules, and they had their plows in the back, you know, and they would come there, load up and go. And a lot of those people were Black, not all, but they would sit down out there while they were waiting to be served because they got last. You know, it didn't matter whether they were there first. If a white person came up, that white person got served. And so they're waiting there, and they told stories and they talked among each other. When I would come sit down because I've always been drawn to storytellers, and I would sit down and listen. At first they're going, I don't know who this kid is, who this white kid, you know. And then but after every once in a while I would encounter the same people, and they begin to say, okay, he's all right. And I would sit and listen, and I listened to their stories, and they quit talking like they talked to other white people, and they started talking like they always talk. And I listened to their stories, and I listened to the way they spoke, and I listened to their problems and things like that. I would, I was always like a sponge. I would suck that stuff in. And it's like the bookmobile would come through Mount Enterprise, and I had a friend who didn't like to read, but he had a card, so he would let me have his books. I would pick the books, and he would pick them, and so I had all these books. And so when it circulated back through, I would have read all of these books, like Huckleberry Finn and so on. And so I had all of that going, all of those things, I think, enlightening me and giving me different viewpoints, as you suggested, along with all these other experiences. And TV was in its infancy. And I was seeing all of these different shows, which were really pulp magazines for the most part, or old radio shows and soap operas that had been moved to television. They all influenced me. And I loved Edgar Rice Burroughs and Jack London. And you look back at some of those things now, you can certainly see that they were sexist, that they were racist, but the stories were tremendous. And I don't judge the books for that time, but I don't accept that aspect. There's a different thing than in knowing what's going on in a book that's good and what's going on that's bad. I can hold two thoughts in my head at the same time. And I think most of us can, if we're allowed to do that and not have to, fit any particular mold that other people want to cast for us. But all of that affected the writing. And I know this is a long way to answer a simple question that should be yes, but that's it. That's it.
Well, no, I'm so glad you elaborated on that, because it all went into, it was all part of the stew that went into your storytelling ability. And in the novel, Dan Simmons, wonderful author Dan Simmons, wrote a foreword, and he talked about he compared this story to Huck Finn, and you had mentioned Huckleberry Finn. And there's something about in the book Edge of Dark Water, that river was the Sabine River, and there's something about, of course, the American experience of driving on a long highway, Route 66, but there's something so idyllic and romantic about traveling by river. You think of Lewis and Clark, and again, Huck Finn. So did you have that experience? I think you talked about that the Sabine River had a particular importance to you when you were growing up.
Yeah, it's in a lot of my books. I even recently wrote an article on the Sabine River that'll be in a book about rivers. It's coming from Texas University. I don't know which press is publishing exactly, so maybe the University of Texas, maybe A&M, I forget. So I don't want to get myself in trouble there. But a river is different even than a highway, because there's life beneath you. There are fish, there are snakes, there are turtles, there are frogs, and so on. There's all kinds of things that are below you. So it's this feeling that life is stacked. There's the bird, there's you, there's the fish below, there's the birds in the sky, you know, and all of this is going on all through these trees, which to me are exotic. And I'm a great fan of conservation and of the environment and trees and rivers, but also it's representational of life itself and of that river and that journey that we have through life. And I've been down that river many times. I'd fished in that river. I'd swam in it a little bit. Not the best river to swim in. It's a very dirty river, but it's just brown, you know. And my father had a friend drowned when he was a kid in the Sabine River, not that same spot, but in what they called a sinkhole or a whirlpool. And so he told me all about that story too, which stayed with him all his life, you know, that he had lost this friend to that river. And the other thing about it too is that I saw that river welding to my experience as a reader of mythology. And so I saw there's a lot of Jason and the Argonauts and the Odyssey and all of that, and as well as Twain and, you know, the Huck Finn thing. All of that is in this, along with my own personal experiences and the mystery that's there. I don't necessarily think of myself as a mystery writer, but I'm a writer who writes with mystery in mind. And so to me, it was somewhat different. I mean, it's not about a ton of clues or things like that, which doesn't, you know, interest me that much. It doesn't mean that I can't read a book that's like that, or that I can't enjoy a film that's like that. But every time I try to do that, it just goes to pieces and I just start telling a story. And so for me, that was a way for me to express all of that stuff. And mythology has always been important to me. And I think mythology is what I'm doing in a way. I'm kind of doing that in East Texas modern mythology. It's rooted in realism, like the Greek gods. They were more real than a lot of other gods, you know, that were always doing human things. And I try to make my characters very realistic, but at the same time, bigger than life. And that comes from mythology, and it comes from the rivers, and it comes from all those things.
Yeah, and so I want to talk about some of the characters specifically in the book. There was Sue Ellen, who I love, Jinx, who just I adore Jinx because she's sort of the unfiltered child that's also brave and doesn't take any guff from anybody. And Terry, who's kind of an outsider. They're all they're all outsiders for different reasons. But did you have, when you started putting the book together, did you envision these characters specifically, or did they grow during the development of the story?
I don't plot stories, you know. I don't have outlines. Sometimes I'll make a few notes or something, but no, I didn't have any of the characters in mind. When I started it, Sue Ellen started talking, but I didn't know who Sue Ellen was. I didn't know who her family was, but every line she revealed to me something. And when she would say things that would tell me things that I didn't know. And her relationship with Jinx told me things, and Jinx's relationship with her told me things. And then, of course, there are Terry and other characters, and even the poor girl who Mary Lynn I forgot her name now, but the ones whose body they pull up. There's a story there too, and you get it through the other characters, and you get it through implied ideas, you know. And it's about this idea too that there's got to be some place that we can go that's better, or there's got to be a plan for the future, and that there's better for us than this, which is, you know, really how I grew up. There's better for me than this. And I don't want to imply that everybody was terrible, and yeah, I don't mean that at all. But I meant that the implication was, when I was growing up, except for what my parents told me, but around everybody else, was that you got older, you got a job when you graduated high school, you might go to college. And I couldn't afford to go to college. I took a couple of years off and on over 4 years period of time, 60 hours, 2 years, 4 years to get it, but at least. But I felt like that the river represented that this some kind of goal. It's we're going to go here, but it's really about the journey. And I believe life's like that too. And I use this in one of my books as a header, is that I think it was Confucius who it's credited to. And it says, if you're not happy with what you got, you won't be happy with what you want. And I'm a big believer in that. I mean, my life is good, but my life has always been good. It just has gotten better. Now, when I get, there's a point where we all run at the end of the river and there's nowhere to go. I mean, that's ultimately the result for all of us, because I don't believe in an afterlife. I believe you live it here and that you treat people as well as you can, and you're not looking for some reward for doing it. And so to me, the river represents all of that and the culmination of that trip. And when I come to it, I don't want to give that away in the book, but I think that it kind of presents that philosophy in such a way that I think you get more what I'm talking about once you get to the end. Because for me, a book can be entertaining, and I think it should be. I don't think any book should not be entertaining. But I think a book that has some character and has some resonance and has some echo is what I prefer to read, because I might actually remember something from it.
Right. At the beginning of the book, what happens shortly after the passage that you read, a gruesome discovery is made. A young woman, the body of a young woman is pulled from the river. And I'm not going to reveal, give any reveals beyond that. But I was so struck by the poignancy of that she was tied by wire to a sewing machine, a Singer's sewing machine. And earlier you talked about recycling everything. And I remember my mother sewing all of her clothes, my grandmother sewing all of her clothes, and talking about recycling feed bags, to make dresses. I found that particularly poignant, but also what I got from that image that was also very poignant was that the very object of domesticity was what was weighing her
That's right.
down. I just thought that was a wonderful image that,
Yeah, and those things like that. It's like when I used to in school, they would go, "We're going to read the Scarlet Letter, and this means this, the rose means this." Could really run a novel for you. But what it made me realize is I don't think that the author sat down and said, "I'm going to do this." I think it comes out of how you think and how you proceed. Right. And I thought about that after I wrote it. I thought, you know what? That Singer machine, that represents not only the fact that my mother had them and I had grown up with them, but it represents that domestic sort of life that she did not want. And there are people who want that life, which makes it fine. But there are people who do not and feel that, especially at that time, and even when I was growing up, women were supposed to have a certain life and they were not allowed. I remember men talking about correcting their wives, and what they meant was hitting them. And this was thought to be okay. Well, it's in the Bible. That's what their usual excuse was, or something like that. This is what a man does, and you can't let a woman talk back to you, meaning that they may have an opinion different than yours. And so all of that stuff, to me, that's what that Singer sewing machine represents for that poor lady who just wants a life outside of this. She wanted to be a movie star,
Right. So you had said earlier that you do not ascribe to an afterlife. However, in the South, and East Texas is a part of that wonderful tradition, superstitious belief, ghosts and haints and boo hags and guana, all of that stuff, the superstitious stuff is thrown into the soup, which is so delicious. And I loved Skunk, who is this semi-mythical, is he real, is he not real? I loved that you put that character in, because as it turns out, he was flesh and blood, right? But he had a mythical element to it. Were those kind of superstitious elements an important part of your storytelling growing up?
Yes, I'm not superstitious myself, outside of something that's subconscious perhaps, but I love that superstitions, and I love those old stories about haints and boogers. You had haints and boogers in East Texas, and you had the goat man, and then of course there was Bigfoot, which came along a little later and more prominent, depending on whichever myth you prescribe to. But you're growing up in the woods. I grew up in the woods. You're out there, alligators are crawling in the water. You hear them splash. There's snakes all over the place, and so all of that stuff gives an atmosphere that's almost mythic to begin with, and it's real. And so it's easy to have this idea about haints and ghosts and boogers and so on. So yeah, it's definitely a big part of a large percentage anyway of my storytelling.
Right. Um, so some of your works have been turned to film. One of my favorites is Cold in July, which was a wonderful, wonderful book and wonderful film. And of course, Bubba Hotep, which has kind of gained iconic stature right now. But I'm just curious to know that The Thicket, which is a great favorite of mine, has long been optioned by Peter Dinklage of Game of Thrones fame, and it planned to go into production, but the virus put the plague put everything on hold. Is there a new update on that you could tell us about?
Yes, it looks like they're going to film it next year, and so that's really all I know right now. But it's still in the wings. Also, I was supposed to direct a film, and I got my chair knocked out from under me during that, and that's still supposed to happen. But in film, you never know what happens. I've been fortunate in that Bubba Hotep, Cold in July, the TV series for Hap and Leonard, they all, I guess, what am I trying to say? They all came out successful, and I liked them well enough. I liked them all a lot. And then we did a Creep Show episode with my kids, and it was based on the story. We didn't do that script, but it was okay too. And an Incident on and Off the Mountain Road, which was done for Masters of Horror. So you got Bubba Hotep, which I don't know what that is. It's kind of horror, it's kind of comedy, it's kind of drama, it's kind of a lot of different things, and I believe it has some elements of many things, including satire and whatever. And then you got Cold in July, which is noir, and you got Hap and Leonard, which it's crime, kind of mystery, kind of adventure, kind of Southern novel, and then you have Incident on the Off the Mountain Road, which is horror, and then the Creep Show thing, which was horror. And so to me, that's what makes it all so good, is to do all these different things. And then for the films to represent that well, is that I've been pretty satisfied. And I'm Edge of Dark Waters under option. It's been under option ever since it came out. So a lot of different things are under option, but all that means is I get a check, and my son and I get a check on The Projectionist, which I'm supposed to direct. And he wrote the script based on the story of mine. And so as long as they keep giving us the checks, I told him, I said, that we'd be better off they never made this. We just keep getting paid. And that might be fun, But I really would like to see it, and I really would like to direct it. And I of course, hope these other things happen too.
You mentioned your son Keith, and I know that family is so important to you. And you've collaborated with Casey, who's an amazing singer. She lives in California. She has her own career as a singer, but you collaborated with her on stories, and you collaborated with your son Keith. And I know that there was a film that was just released, I believe in August, The Pale Door, which he co-wrote the script. And were you the producer on that?
Mm-hmm. I am a producer on that. I'm sort of the creative producer. I'm not the money guy. I'm not good at hunting up money. But I was kind of the creative producer on that. And it came out 2-3 weeks ago. I'm not sure exactly. And it's done pretty well for him, and it's got him more work. And he's sold, he's done 3 screenplays. 2 of them have been filmed. And one of them is the one I was telling you about that we have to do, we hope. When all this is over. Plus, he's had a short story he and his sister and I wrote many years ago when they were 8 and 12, and it was filmed for a Creep Show recently. And there are other things that are in the wings that I can't talk about, but it looks like. And then Keith and I just wrote a novel together called Big Lizard, and it's a kind of fantasy superhero novel, which is another thing to do different. And it's coming out before long. So, and then Casey and I had a book of stories called Terra Is Our Business. It's a short story collection, and it's sort of supernatural detectives, and it's different than what I normally do. But Casey gave it her own kind of spectrum there. Brought in her own elements and things, and then she and I have some other things coming out. My son and I have some other things coming out. My wife and I have done things together before. So, and my brother also writes, and we've done things together, and so. I guess it's a family affair, but I got it all started, and everybody went, well, if that dummy can do it, I bet I can.
Well, it's it's literally a whirlwind of creativity, and it's so I every time I talk to you, every time I speak to you, and just only a few weeks or months could go by, and you have something new in the works. So it's so invigorating to hear you talk about your projects. I'm going to go to some of our attendees here. We've got a few questions for you. David asked, hear you speak about writing in the voice of a girl, a female. Was it difficult? And what was the inspiration? So what was, I mean, I know you write a lot of female characters, but I guess this specific question was for Sue Ellen in this book.
Yeah. You know, I don't normally think I'm going to write a book with a female or a male character or an older character or a younger character. It's just that sometimes a story, and stories seem to come to me. It's like, was it Zeus that gave Athena birth through his skull, you know, and she, the stories are sort of like that. And once they start, they feed themselves. And I'm sure what's going on there is that my subconscious has been thinking about these things maybe for months or years or whatever. And at some point it floats up through all of that subconscious matter and makes itself conscious enough to where I start writing. But I write about 3 hours a day. I write about 3 to 5 pages a day. I try to get the voice, the character, as close as I can get it in that 3 hours. I rewrite then. I don't do all these different rewrites. I do, you know, one draft and a polish, but I'm rewriting daily. And I'll usually get about halfway and I will go back and read it and then continue. And then I'll read the other half and then I give it the polish. But so to me, I'm doing it as I go. So I don't have all these drafts and I'm confused and I get disappointed and I don't want to do it anymore. And I hate everybody. And it's just, I don't want to do that. So for me, whether it's a female character or a male character or whatever, it comes to me every day. It comes to me daily. It's like I'm fed this piece daily. Now, my subconscious, I have no idea how much it has in the reservoir. But I usually, by the time I get up in the morning and my feet hit the floor, it's already going. And I get the coffee, you know, maybe take the dog out. And then when I sit down and I do my email and I do the Facebook thing, which takes me about 15 minutes to do both. And then I start writing. And sometimes I get 3 to 5 pages in 30 minutes. Sometimes it'll take me the 3 hours. But I generally seldom write beyond that 3 hours unless I'm traveling and I'm having to work piecemeal, you know. But I don't find that I have much trouble doing that. That doesn't mean that I haven't had a few books that were harder than others or stories that were harder than others or even articles. But in general, writing for me is a great pleasure. And if it's not a pleasure, you ought not be doing it. That's the way I feel. And if you're not creating something every day, or if you're waiting for the muse, which is you know, you're the muse, so what are you waiting for? Every day is not going to be a delight. And what people talk about, the muse hit me, means they're excited that day. They're happy that day. But a lot of times, if you look at what you wrote on the day that you felt you had the muse, it's not any different on the day when the muse was on vacation. So, and the more you sit down and do it, the more the muse shows up. The muse shows up through practice, because that's what it is. It's like lifting weight. You know, you're lifting weights and you're getting stronger. Well, it's like that with the story. The more you try to sit down. And I like the same time every day, generally, roughly. You know, I get up in the morning and I write then, and then I'm done. I do other stuff during the day. Because if I write long stretches, and I've done it a few times when I had like a pushing deadline, but I don't like it. If I write long stretches, I get diminishing returns. And it's like I get finished and I've got all this power in what I've written, and there's residue left over. And then when I go to bed at night, the residue, kind of like sourdough, you know, you take a little pinch of that and make some bread out of it, but you still got some sourdough. And that's the way that subconscious is for me. So that's the way I work. And at the end of every week, you know, you look at it, if I've got 3 pages to 5 pages a day, I've got quite a few pages. And the joy of this is some days I'll get 10, 15, 20 pages, and it's still within about that time. And it's not like I'm trying to stick to that. It's just the way my mind works. It says, okay, you got this time, you're going to get done. And like I say, if I get it done in 30 minutes, I might go, well, you know, that's enough for today. I don't feel anymore. I'm quitting. But I got my minimum. And I never quit unless I get my minimum. And there's been like a few days when I didn't. But that's really rare. I can generally get 3 to 5 pages almost effortlessly. And you know, it doesn't mean that I just put a sack over its head and do it for old glory. It means that I really care about what I'm doing, and I'm excited about what I'm doing. and that the joy tries to come through the fingertips. And you know, you don't always achieve it, but a lot of times I think I do.
Well, I think we have a lot of burgeoning writers in this group, and I think it's really helpful, very useful for people to hear you talking about the way you work, because every writer works differently. And the
Sure.
key
And
is
different things work for different writers.
different times work, different, you know, some people like to give themselves a minimum number of words, but I think you hit on a very important point, and that is consistency. That
That
you
is, I
just
believe that's
need to do it, and that the muse,
you got to read, and you got to read
and
a lot.
yeah, I agree. I think that's really important. Another question from Francis, and I think you talked a little bit about this in your process of writing. Do you consciously balance dialogue and narrative, or do the characters dictate this? Do the characters
dictated. I don't believe in those things where you have to have this many, you know, the paragraph needs to be this size and the sentence needs to be this size, and you got the dialogue here. You have to introduce this character here, and if that character's prominent, and I'm going to check off, like he used to say, if a gun appears here, it has to appear later. So a lot of times I'll have the gun appear and you never see it again. So I violate rules like that. I'm very much a storyteller, but I'm also a stylist. I care how it sounds. I care explicitly, you know, how it's going to chew in the mouth, you know, and how it's going to sound in the head. And so for me, the story itself dictates the dialogue and all those other elements.
Very good. And your narration, you're a great storyteller, but it really sings. Your stories really sizzle through the dialogue that your characters speak. And like you said, the way it sounds, either spoken or just the way it sounds in your head, it always feels authentic. And I think you get the feeling that you're drawing, even though your characters don't match up perfectly with real life people, you get the feeling that people are living, breathing, dimensional humans. And so that's, so I have another question.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go
Say
ahead.
what you were going to say.
No. I was just going to say, it's not about writing people as they are. It's about writing people as you think they are. And writing dialogue, it's not about writing realistic dialogue. It's about writing dialogue that convinces people it's realistic and that it's interesting. And again, it's that whole idea of mythology married to reality. And if you use enough real elements, that when you have something that's more fantastic, people will embrace it, or more outstanding, people will embrace it, you know. And everybody has a different kind of story they want to tell. So I'm not dictating story to anyone.
Right. Okay, so let's see. Somebody asked, do you write longhand, or are you writing at a screen, a computer screen?
I'm the screen, you know, it goes directly in. And I used to write on typewriters, and I had, you know, ribbons, and I had carbons and all that stuff. And and I loved the typewriter, but once I got on a computer, a word processor, I never wanted to go back, because I'm a messy writer. I write really fast, and I also spell terribly. And I didn't say smell terribly. I want that to be understood. I smell bad, maybe, I don't know, but I certainly spell bad. And so I like that machine to help me out on that. To me, it just makes life so much easier to just put it right on the screen. Some people I know like to write longhand. I don't. I can't even read my own writing when it gets cold, you know, so I'm straight to the screen.
Somebody asked a question about, let's see, where did it go? It keeps jumping around. So let me see if I can find this question. It was about could you talk about here it is. Okay, so David asks, I'd love to know if Joe has read John D. MacDonald, who wrote Mystery Set in Florida. He was also a great conservationist.
Right.
So
I
what
have,
what
yes.
other
I read all of his standalone novels that I could find. I think I have all of them, but I don't know quite that I've read all of them, but I close. And I've read all the Travis McGee. And my favorites were actually the standalone novels. But I've had someone say, and I think it's accurate on the Hap and Leonard series, that Hap and Leonard are the illegitimate children of Travis McGee. And I think that's a funny statement, and I think it could be true. And I think he's an influence on the more crime, first-person stuff than maybe some. Hemingway's a big influence because of the way he wrote. He was, I think, he was the most important writer of the first half of the 20th century. I don't think there's any question. It's not a matter whether you like him, dislike him, or whatever. He changed the way people wrote, and he changed the way a lot of people wrote that don't even know it, that they're influenced by him. And he changed the way a lot of people wrote that hate him. And you know, he was a character that you could really like in many ways and just loathe in others. But boy, could he write. And certain things have grown out of his work and John D. MacDonald would be an example, and probably John D. MacDonald through Hemingway and John O'Hara, because there's a lot of John O'Hara in the Travis McGee books. Well, in fact, in all of John D. MacDonald. So, yeah.
Right. You also said that Burroughs was a big influence
Yes.
on you early on. What were some of the writers that you felt helped you catch fire and want to express yourself in writing? Who were some of those
When I was younger,
writers?
Rice Burroughs, you know, there's no doubt it was Burroughs, and Jack London and Rudyard Kipling, and you know, and a ton of pulp writers. And in the early 60s, it was a lot of science fiction writers, some of which weren't good and some of which really were. Philip Jose Farmer was a big influence on me, and I knew Farmer a little bit, and he was a hero of mine. And, yeah, Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett and James Cain. I mean, and that list could go on and on. I could spend here all night. And individual books, a lot of times, where I might not like the totality of someone's work. I might like an individual child that they birthed, like you know, They Shoot Horses, Don't They, by Horace McCoy.
Right.
It's just an amazing book. And his other books are okay, but that one's killer. That one transcended just the pulp factor and became a major American novel in my view. And there were so many. I wrote F. Scott Fitzgerald, you know, William Faulkner, Flannery O'Connor, Carson McCullers. She was great. Harper Lee, her one novel, well, maybe two novels, but one novel. And so many different writers, you know. There's Chester Himes, who wrote the crime novels as well as straight novels about race, a black writer who eventually moved to France and wrote over there, you know, and wrote his novels that were made into things like Cotton Comes to Harlem and film and other films. But so many people, Ralph Ellison, you know, the one great novel, The Invisible Man, all of that stuff I mean, I get talking about it, I get excited, and I get so excited because these things meant so much to me. And some of them I reread from time to time. I just reread Lord of the Flies the other day, and I thought, wow, now this is how it's done. Ray Bradbury, Richard Matheson, Charles Beaumont, my friend Bill Nolan, William F. Nolan. I mean, there's so many people that have influenced me through different periods, and some have sort of echoed and stayed with me through the entire time of my career.
Right. Well, all of the books that you mentioned are written at very different styles, different voices, different genres, if you will. And I think that's a really important point. You talked about to be a writer, you have to be a good reader. And the fact that your reading habits were so universal, so Catholic with a small c, it was so diverse. I think that's a very, very important thing, because a lot of people get hooked on a certain genre and that's all you read. And I think that for a writer, it can do you a disservice, because there are always little bits and pieces that you can absorb, you know, science fiction, fantasy, crime, mystery, all that kind of stuff. And so it seems as though your reading style helped diversify your own writing style.
Well, you know that my parents, my father couldn't read or write, by the way. He couldn't, you know, he got to where he could write his name and maybe dope out a newspaper and stuff when he got older, but he couldn't read or write. But he was a great storyteller. So I absorbed that. I absorbed from the books. Comic books were really the reason I became a writer, because when I was really young, I wanted to write comic books. Of course, I grew up to write comic books. I also wrote Batman, the animated series, and Superman, the animated series, and Son of Batman, and Jonah Hex, and you know, so I wrote animation too. All my loves, that's, you know, that's what I wanted to do with my life, was to pursue my loves and make a living out of it. In the meantime, you know, I had to work at aluminum chair factories. I had to work in farming. I had a goat dairy. My wife and I did. I worked in as a janitor for years. I was a bouncer. I did all, you know, I'm a martial artist. I've been doing that for 58 years. And so all of these things, you know, I think contribute to the way you see things, and not knowing what was good for me or bad for me and just what I wanted to read, you know, and I read a tremendous amount of nonfiction as well, Western history in particular, but I used to love to read all kinds of, you know, supposedly true ghost stories, or just because of the feeling they could give me, because even as someone who doesn't believe in an afterlife, I have an imagination, and my imagination is constantly fueled by all of these different things. You know, some days I want it very straight, other days I want the fantastic, you know. So to me, I think is not having and music is a big influence, even painting. I mean, I look at Goya and I go, oh my God, that's some scary stuff. Or you look at Van Gogh and you're seeing some universe that's outside of anything you understand, because even though you know that starry night, that don't look like any starry night, you know. That looks like looking at like you're on some other planet looking at the sky. And to me, all of those things, I absorbed them, and they came out to be whatever it is I do. Are we still here?
Yeah. No. Kathleen, do you have a few more questions you want to ask, or?
I think she's frozen.
Oh, okay.
She's frozen.
She looks amazing, but I think she's frozen. Kathleen, yeah, she's frozen. I can go through some of these questions. Have you ever read You've read The Moviegoer, right?
Yes, I have.
Have you read other novels of his by any chance? I'm curious. Like, I would like a recommendation.
That's the only one I've read.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I think that's the only one I've read.
God, you've read.
I know it's the only one I've read.
Is there a writer you've read who you never want to read again?
Well, there are some writers I read that I thought were really good, but I would never read that book again. I've read some writers that I thought were really good, but I respect it more than I like it. You know, I'm one of those people. I'm not a Cormac McCarthy fan, but I respect him, and I think he's brilliant at what he does. But I like No Country for Old Men, but I find it pretentious, and I you know, and it's funny because I'm often compared to him in some areas, and I get that, and I think he's a great writer, but he may not be the writer for me. And I've read 2 or 3, well, more than that. I probably read 4 or 5 of his books, so obviously I have respect for them. But I always feel like I'm looking for something I don't get, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I get it. Oh, you're back.
Hey, I'm back. Sorry about that. I had to change. To change computers.
Oh my God, it's like doppelganger central here.
Well, you look great up here. We got like a still photo of you.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I froze. So anyway, so I guess David, you were having a conversation.
I was being you very badly, so it's all you again. I'm gonna mute myself.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. So I think we're coming up on the hour. Blake or Alexander, do you have any questions that you'd like to ask Joe?
No, sure, Kathleen. Those are amazing questions. A really wonderful, rich conversation. We have often what we do sometimes is we ask the audience to unmute themselves, and they can kind of more spontaneously ask a question that might have occurred to them. And we do have just a few left. I think, let me just see. Taylor Newcomb, do you want to unmute yourself? You had a really nice question in the chat about developing voice that you wanted to ask Joe about.
Sure. I was just asking, Joe, how did you develop your voice? Was it just something you just came to you, or was it just trial and error?
I think it was trial and error. The funny thing is you have your own voice, but you don't always recognize that you're hearing somebody else's voice in your head. You're hearing all the voices that you're reading. You're hearing all the voices that you think you should be speaking in. You're being a ventriloquist at first, and then I think in time you start to find your own voice through experimenting. And I think there are some people that never find it, but most good writers, I believe, do find it. And I do believe it's primarily trial and error, but it's also reading. And once in a while, you'll find a voice. When I read Flannery O'Connor, and I recognize that voice. That's South. It may not be East Texas, but it's the South, and that opened a door. And then I read Hemingway, and that sort of blunt, sort of masculinity that was in it. I grew up with those guys. And I read F. Scott Fitzgerald, who was a poet, and you recognize pieces of yourself in those. And eventually that you start putting that together, patchwork, and then eventually you crumble that up and throw it away, and you found the way you're going to speak. But you learn it from other people. It opens doors.
Thank you.
No, I love that that idea of finding voice. I know this is probably going to seem out of whatever some crazy kind of segue into this, but I actually was thinking a little bit of like Apocalypse Now and The Heart of Darkness, when just, especially The Heart of Darkness, because just the amazing atmosphere and kind of the thickness of detail. I mean, just reading the first 5 pages of your book, there's all these great characters that are introduced. So I had just a quick question I was going to ask, and then I'd love to hear more questions from everyone else. And I think Kathleen kind of asked it, but for example, for this book, did place come, like, did you first write out of a sense of place or a sense of character?
I did.
Okay.
Right. I don't think I answered that earlier, and Kathleen certainly mentioned it about the South, but absolutely. I mean, the stuff I write is out of that. And by the way, I really like Conrad. I read quite a few books by him. But yeah, I think that's true. I think if you have a sense of place, you also have a sense of voice, because place and voice are intertwined. And I think the way people talk is sort of where they're from. And I mean that in the sense of the environment. I know that doesn't sound like it makes much sense at first, but I think I'm more kind of liquidy and kind of rolling hills, with my voice. When I go to West Texas, they're much drier, and they take a long time to get where they're going, which is the way it is when in West Texas. It takes a long time to get there. And Amarillo, and when you get into Dallas, everything's in a hurry. Everybody talking like, hey, you want to go? I'm going to Dallas. Boy, you want to go with me? And so it's like, what? And so I do believe that, on paper, it's going to be a little different, but I do believe you have a rhythm. And a lot of the rhythm of the Southern writer, and especially those of generations from mine backwards, I don't know about forwards, comes from the lilt of the Old Testament and Shakespeare even. It's that whole lilt. That's why preachers have that Southern preachers have that voice like they have. It comes out of that background of hearing the preacher speak in that sort of overdone sort of voice, but it becomes very poetic in its own way. And I always felt that, even though I'm not a churchgoer, and I always, I was as a kid, I listened to all those voices, and I thought, this is why I'm not a Christian. This is not thrilling me at all. I was going to be a preacher until I was 11, and I read the Bible all the way through, and it cured me. So anyway, what I did was that, many people I know, they've never read it, and they're always talking about it. But for me, I listened to that, and I thought, wow, what beautiful language, what poetic language. And so I'm not writing in that language, but I'm writing in that rhythm. And I think a lot of other Southern writers do that, whether they mean to or not. There's that whole, emphasis on how you express yourself and the way you delay words and the way you speed up words.
I've never heard someone describe their voice as liquidy. That's pretty great, Joe. No, that's a wonderful explanation. Yeah, no, it's, there was another question. Nick, did you want to ask yours? Because it's all connected to voice and everything you were saying. Does Joe have any exercises? Do you want to unmute yourself and just ask that question?
Yes. Yeah, thank you for taking my question. I was asking specifically if there was any methods or exercises that you've done early on in the process of writing a book if you're trying to discover a character's specific voice. I've had issues myself when you're dealing with 3-4 characters in a group and you're trying to make sure that the writer or the reader understands that these are different people and you're not confusing them, so you're not overloading them with tags.
Yeah. Well, you know, when I first started out as a writer, I did a lot of different exercises, and I wrote a lot of, I would do an exercise to start before I wrote the story I was actually working on. And sometimes they weren't connected at all, but they sort of loosened me up, so to speak. But to be more direct to your question is that if you can visualize those characters in your head as different and you can hear them talk, even though sometimes things are going to be similar, you're not going to get away from that because words are words. But you find a rhythm of speech, you find maybe certain, and you know, I think people make the mistake of thinking if I give them some gimmick when they talk, that's going to make the difference. It's really how you visualize those characters in your head. And I say the same thing about character. An eye patch or limp are not characters. Those are what characters have. What makes a character is what they think about that eye patch and what they think about that limp and how it's affected their lives, not the damn eye patch. And some people think, I gave him an eye patch, I made him different. No, you gave him an eye patch. But when you hear these things in your head, you have to hear that particular writer speaking in your head. And if you can't, you're not there yet. You're not there yet. When I hear this writer speak, they don't talk like that writer or that writer. They all have a different voice. And so to me, once I can find that point in my head, I can write that more accurately. You know, I don't do everything perfect. You know, I have a perfect plan. But it's like, I can't remember who it was, which boxer was it? It wasn't Muhammad Ali, but one of them said, everybody got a plan till they get hit. And it's kind of that way when you're writing. If you have too much of a plan, it's going to ruin you. So my plan is daily. And my plan for the voice is to be as much like that character when I write their line. It's in a sense connected to acting. And in acting, you know, you have that, what's my motivation? And the answer is your paycheck. But the bigger answer that they're looking for is, why would I do that? Now, you can carry that to extremes where it's just damn silly, but I think you have to look at your characters that way. Why would they say that? Are you making them say that? Are you pushing them around like chess pieces? And once you quit doing that, they start speaking to you, I think. And Kathleen's a great example of that. Her books, they're just delicious. And she has a tense that I don't normally like, that other people write in, and I don't normally like it. But with her, I can read 2 sentences and I'm gone. I'm in that story. I'm in that character. And I think it's something that comes from you believing in your characters. That's the best way I describe it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's a great answer. I'm a poet, Joe, but you have me wanting to like take pen to paper and try some characters out myself. There are characters in poems, but maybe not quite as often. I did mean to include, we had a great question from the pre-submitted questions from Doris. Is Doris here tonight? Doris, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Well, my question was about the cops, because they're certainly not nice guys. And I just, I guess what I want to know is, do you think there was systemic corruption in law enforcement during the Depression? And it seems to me in most of your books that cops are jerks.
Yeah, they're also the heroes in some of them. You know, I've had them where they're also the heroes because cops are like everybody else. Some of, you know, I've had friends that were great cops, but I've known people I thought were horrible cops because I've known people that were horrible people, and I've known people that were great people. And you also have to understand, if you're writing crime novels, you're not writing about the best examples of humanity generally, because that's why they're crime novels. That's why they're mystery novels. That's why they're dark novels. But I think that there's always been corruption in law enforcement, but that doesn't mean all law enforcement is corrupt, if that makes sense. But there's certainly been times in the Dallas Police Department, the Los Angeles Police Department, and the Chicago, different eras when they were worse, but I don't think it goes away. But I think that there are always these people that are trying to do the right thing, that are having to battle uphill constantly, you know. But I mean, when I was growing up, the Dallas police force was known for being brutal. When I was a kid, you know, don't go to Dallas, boy, don't mess up there, because you know, they'll whoop your ass and leave you in the ditch with a bottle up your butt. And so you know, you didn't want to get messed up. So there's always been that element, but crime fiction deals with human weakness, and human weakness is in anything. It doesn't have to be the police, but it certainly can be. And when you're writing crime novels, you're approaching the lesser side, the darker side, the more confused side of humanity, or the person who doesn't have that human connection, who lacks empathy, or who looks at it as like, okay, I'm doing the right thing most of the time, so just because I'm taking a little graft here or dealing with prostitutes for my own entertainment and pleasure, that doesn't make me a bad cop. So you rationalize, and when you write those characters, you always have to believe those characters believe what they're doing, and that it makes sense to them anyway. So you don't ever write a villain with, like, you know, Snidely Whiplash, because none of us are perfect, but some of us are less perfect. But they have reasons. I mean, Hitler liked dogs. So, you know, there's always that kind of element to character that you have to give something that shows that they have the same human instincts that we have. They just don't always act the same. None of us act the same. There's a thin line between good and bad. And some people are right there on that line, and some people step over it deliberately. Some people step over it accidentally, and some people like that side better. And so I think you got to have to, you know, think of it that way as a writer. And you know, and I do use real incidents and real people sometimes, but again, I go back to the fact I'm writing crime fiction, so I'm looking for the darker aspects.
Okay.
But I think I think a lot of the dark aspects are funny. I mean, that's going to make a lot of people mad, but a lot of humor is in my novels, because I find the human condition just damn funny in a horrible way sometimes, and in a delightful way other times. Thank you.
No, that's a great question, Doris. No, and I would agree there is humor in your writing. There's that great description, is it the cop's tummy? In the first chapter, it was like a dog jumping up on him. I was like, I don't think I've ever heard anyone describe someone's tummy like that. It was a great description, Joe.
You know, I also like to take credit for a lot of stuff I steal from my relatives and from the South, you know, so, but I do, but they inspire you to think of others, because it's a way of looking at things. It's hyperbole and you know, metaphorical, satirical. It has all these things going, you know, similes. All of this, I think, comes from the way Southerners think, at least older Southerners. I think that's changing now because culture's changing.
That's a great point. I think we have one great question also in the chat from Tamara, and it's all about place and how much that influenced you. Tamara, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? It's a really interesting one.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Tamara. Hi, how are you?
Hi. Well, what I put in the chat is that I'm from the Gladewater, Liberty City, Kilgore area, right off of.
I know it well, and I know Kathleen does.
Yeah, and I was wondering that I know I'm in my 40s, and I noticed, you know, pretty much my whole life that when I do encounter people that, even if they do come from other small towns, like when I went to college. I live now here in Cedar Hill in the Dallas area, but when I meet other people that are of my same age range, not just writers, but, you know, just anyone, that I notice there's such a drastic difference between my perception of the world. And maybe I'm the odd one, I'm not sure. I'm not saying that they're odd either, but I do notice there's such a difference between how my upbringing influenced how I perceive the world. A lot of the things that you spoke about in valuing having things, saving almost everything, a lot of those things were a great part of my life because I grew up from a family that I had grandparents, great grandparents that, you know, they were farmers, they had horses and cows, and we ate off the land. We, you know, very rarely went out to the restaurant, or we very rarely ate cookies that came from a store. And so I have a different perception on how I treat people when I purchase things. When I make things, my whole perception of the world is completely different from a lot of people that are in my same age group. And I find that it heavily, almost sometimes too much, influences how I write. And I was wondering if you had that same experience, you know, knowing what it feels like to have been in and lived in, and the people in Gladewater, because it's a different feel.
Well, Tamara, I think that you should not try to mute that at all, because that's you. And I think what you're doing is you're bringing yourself to your fiction and bringing other people you knew, at least your perception of them, to that fiction. I wouldn't mute that at all. And I think that it gives you a true, authentic, you know, way to write. I mean, somebody else from somewhere else, from a city or whatever, it can give them an authentic way of writing too, but that's not your authenticity. And I think you should stick with that. And I think that if you do that, there are real stories there. 'Cause like you, we raised a lot of our food, you know, and we hunted for food. And I'm not somebody who likes killing animals, but back then I liked eating, and we shot squirrel and sometimes quail and dove, and we fished and all those things. And that was part of it. And we grazed vegetables. I had a goat dairy. I think that even if you're not writing about that, you're always writing about that. And what I mean by that is you can even take Robert E. Howard, who wrote Conan stories. He was a Texan. And when you start reading those, you really realize those are about oil field workers. They're about regular people working regular jobs, except they got a sword in their hand. So it depends on how close you want to get to the bone. I get pretty close to the bone a lot of times, but sometimes you're just sucking the marrow, you know, and that's okay too. But you want to keep what's you authentic. And you don't want to get away from that. And your experience and mine are going to be similar, but they're going to be different too, because you're going to have your own personal area that may be different from my personal area, because we're close, but you're a little younger. So that makes your experience a little different.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
We have about, wow, time's just like flying by. It's like 8:29. I can't believe it. Does anyone have like one last burning question to ask Joe? He's been really a rich person to be able to exchange ideas with tonight. Okay. I think it's exactly almost 8:30.
Okay.
I guess, Kathleen, you did a fantastic job asking questions. Joe, yeah, you're creative. Yeah. Did you want to ask, just make a final comment or question, Kathleen, or are you fine? And
I just wanted to thank Joe. I mean, Joe is a dream interview because, you know, he's so filled with so many great stories, and I just really appreciate you being here tonight, Joe. And you're so generous. You're so generous in terms of your support of other authors, and generous with your acquired wisdom and experience. So I want to thank you for coming tonight and just sharing your work with us. That was great.
Well, I want to thank all of you for putting up with me, and I appreciate it. I really do.
No, it was a great great evening. It went by quickly. I think there's so much more we want to be able to talk about with you, Joe. And Blake, we have a follow-up Zoom feature with Joe again, correct? When's the date? It's just escaping me right now.
30th,
yeah, the 30th. Somehow we wrangled Joe into doing 2 of these, and we'll have Harry Hunsicker moderating on the 30th.
Oh, okay.
So
I know Harry.
Yeah. Yeah, so we really lucked out having Kathleen and Harry get to be in conversation with you, Joe. So will be different questions. It'll be a whole nother conversation, and we're really looking forward to it in 2 weeks. And it'll be the same link that you used to get here tonight. But thank you. It's just a real pleasure to get to sit in and listen to these conversations every couple weeks. Joe, thank you. Kathleen, thank you so
Welcome.
much. And thank you all for being here tonight. Hopefully we'll see you in 2 weeks with Harry Hunsicker and Joe Lansdale.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Good night.
great
Bye.
conversation.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Kathleen. Oh, she left. That was that. She's out.
She was a
Ouch.
great moderator. She was really just nice to have. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. She was great. I love when she froze. I was like, what the fuck?